Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Plant Party, If a Tree Falls in a Forest, hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Funding for this program is provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and, of course, fun education. I'm Megan Clayton, professor and extension range specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. My co-hosts are Tim Sigmund, the private lands program leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Charles Kniper, state resource conservationist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We have 25 wonderful door prizes that we'll be giving away. Our door prize donor may have consistently donated every plant party to support you in your quest to learn more about plants. I'd like to thank Bamert Seed, Bear Crop Science, Native American Seed, Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas Brigades, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these neat prizes.
Today will be Dr. Eric Taylor. Dr. Taylor serves currently as a silviculturalist for Texas A&M Forest Service and an extension specialist for Forestry for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He received his BS in Forestry from Stephen F. Austin State University in 1988 and an MS in 1990 from SFA, as well as his PhD from Texas A&M University in 1998. Dr. Taylor has published numerous articles and has organized and taught numerous workshops on silviculture and related topics. He's a fellow of the Society of American Foresters and has received numerous awards for his outreach and education efforts, such as the USDA Forest Service and NRCS Two Chiefs Awards in 2012 and 2016, as well as the Society of American Foresters Lawrence C. Walker Distinguished Service to Forestry Award in 2008. Dr. Taylor is a forest landowner and lifetime member of the Texas Forestry Association. With that, we welcome Dr. Taylor and ask him to kick off our presentations with what is a forest anyways?
Hey, well, good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I have so much that I would like to share with you about what is a forest, and with my later topic on forest management, that it was hard for me to really narrow down what I could speak to you in about 15 minutes, but let's try to do it. So let's look at what is a forest. And if you think about that, what comes to mind? What are the visions that come to mind when I say the word forest? Is it really only the trees out there? Are you also maybe picturing the animals or fish? What about streams and lakes? And what does a forest mean to you? Is it really related to who owns that property, from maybe it's a federal or state? What about houses that may be built amongst the forest? And how big of an area are we talking about? 5 acres, 5,000 acres, 25,000 acres? And do we include plantations as a forest? And of course, do you think about the ecological processes like the nutrient or energy cycling that maybe could be happening in a forest stand? And there certainly are many, many different views on this. And this is something that as a forest silviculture, as a forest manager, a forester, we have to sometimes change our terminology based on the audience that we are speaking to, because in many people's minds, whether they even own 200 or 300 acres, forested acres, they still think that forest might be, those properties are owned by government, and they don't own forests, they own a woods or woodlands. And then we also think about the terminology can get kind of fuzzy too when we think about savannas and prairies that have a few trees on them. Where is the line between what is a savanna and then what turns into a forest stand? So take, for instance, the pictures that you see here on the screen. Is this a savanna or is this a forest? Well, this is a well-managed Longleaf Pine plantation that would be very similar to what it would have been like when the Europeans first arrived, and they would have called that probably a heavy savanna. So there are some little nuances there that we think about. So let's dive into maybe a definition or two, and I'm just going to present the easiest definition. Is a forest is an area of land that's dominated by trees and generally has 10% tree crown cover. And it's important to note that we can call an area a forest, even if it's completely lacking trees, as long as it has some trees on in the past and will grow trees in the near future. And that is a topic for deforestation that if we have time, we might delve into here a little bit. If you look at a more complete definition of a forest, it's a community of trees. I'm saying trees because I'm going to emphasize that for a minute. Shrubs and herbs and associated plants and the organisms that rely on those plants that cover a considerable area. They all use oxygen, they use water, they use soil nutrients. And so it's the entire ecosystem that we like to include as we think about a forest and the complexities that go amongst those ecosystems, not just the trees on there. But there are many definitions. So what is a crown? I mentioned 10% crown cover. So the crown is the leafy part of a tree. And so if we were to take a number of trees and measure up all their crowns, and if it's the measurement of those crowns makes up more than 10% of that acre, then we would cover that. We would count that as a forest, at least by FIA standards. And we'll get into that in just a minute. And I keep mentioning the word tree. Well, what is a tree? Not all trees are equal, like we're not all redwoods and sequoias, but trees are going to be woody, perennial plants that tend to have, but not always, one central stem or trunk. And then we like to tag some type of height limitation on that. And usually you'll see 15 feet. I like to use 12 feet, but those are just really arbitrary because, it depends on what the age of the tree is. It depends on what the conditions of that tree grew. Some of the oldest trees in the world, like the bristlecone pine, may not be more than 12 feet tall or even shorter, but it's definitely a tree. If you can contrast that then with things like terms like shrubs, those shrubs are also woody. They're also perennial plants. But one of the things we like to do is to differentiate that because they tend to have multiple stems coming from the ground line, and they're generally going to be less than 12 feet. And of course, there's going to be, those are just general statements. And so we can find examples of differences in each of those categories. So if we think about this, then we're really looking at a forest. It's this really complex ecological ecosystem that is characterized by multiple layers of functional parts. And so we have not only the very tip of that forest might be the crowns of the tree, which all those crowns added together would be the canopy, right? A tree has a crown, a forest has a canopy. And there's a number of things that take place in there that are all ecosystem driven. And you move it down a little bit, you might have what we call a mid-story, where we have smaller trees that are occupying that space between the top canopy and the forest floor are equally important trees. And they have a whole nother suite of processes that are happening there. You get down a little lower, you have shrubs that are just above, ground line, maybe 10 feet or so. And then you have the ground cover, native grasses, other types of things are important. And then you have all the wildlife that depends upon that. And then, of course, all the ecosystem functions that happen in the forest. And all this is very complex. And so we had to, as foresters, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is that we try to manage all those things, or at least consider all those things during our management. A couple of terms that you might like to know as we are forest types. And so we divide things, we tend to call things, there's different types of trees out there. There's different types of ecosystems out there. We like to group those in terms of the dominant tree that is populating that area. So we have these forest types that are really based on what the tree structure is: oak, hickory, spruce, fir, loblolly pine, longleaf pine. If you want to get, but it's not just the trees. That's just an easy way for us to visualize it. But what we really mean when we say that is all the stuff that comes with it, the plants and animals that depend upon that overstory tree type. And then another term you need to know too is forest stand. We have a stand is going to be it's going to be a smaller section of a forest that has enough uniformity to it that it's all about the same age, it's all about the same spatial arrangement, and it's all very similar, and it's dissimilar from neighboring stands. And so we can treat that stand as one management unit to help us achieve our goals and things. So forests cover about 31% of the land area on the earth. So forests are substantial. And you can see here a picture of the different types, different continents with their forest cover. And the United States is blessed with a lot of trees. In fact, we have good coverage and the infrastructure then to get to our forests, unlike many other areas of the world. If you look at the United States, we're about 2/3 or 1/3 or so of the U.S. is forested for about 800 million acres or so. And you can see there a concentration of forests in the east, the southeast, where 13 states in the southeast, we would consider that to be the wood basket of the world, because we have a lot of forests that we can manage to a great extent to produce a lot of wood products and do it sustainably and safely. And then you see other areas of the world. The Northeast has heavy forest cover, and of course the West, Pacific Northwest. You might think, well, what's the difference between what we see in the Southeast versus what we see in the Northwest? And that would certainly be ownership patterns, right? In the South, we're going to have mostly privately owned lands, where in the West, we're going to have mostly publicly owned lands. And that has a lot of difference on what we can do on those particular acreages. If you look in the South, you can see the forest types. And we break those down into some broad terms. And in East Texas, you can see that we have the green and the yellow, where we have a loblolly and shortleaf pine groups. And we also have the oak pine type of groups mixed in there. And as you move to central Texas or so, you get to an oak hickory, then eventually to something like an elm ash cottonwood type of group. And so you can continue to break down these ecoregions into the prominent forest types that's on there. Now in Texas, according to FIA data, we actually have 62.4 million acres of forests. And that's, that's a term, and we pop that out that sometimes people get their fist all formed and up in arms, because we have to consider what we are actually defining a forest to be. And just because we have a forest there doesn't mean there should be a forest there. So it may have a lot of tree and encroachment here in central Texas that maybe shouldn't be considered to be forest at all. But if you look at East Texas, that's traditionally, historically, it's going to be very similar to the other southern states, in that we have enough rainfall there and soil types that we have the species compositions there that you would find in other southern states. And of course, then that's going to be where all of our timber production takes place as well in the state, or at least most of it. You can break your state down into very complex ecoregions, but we're not going to look at that. We'll look at this one instead, where you can see the East Texas piney woods with a little sliver down here in Bastrop, the lost pines. And then we have, of course, we have the post oak savanna, and then the Blacklands prairie. And you can see how that kind of moves on and on. You might pick up some more forest especially as you get out of here in the Ponderosa area and the mountain forest. And so we have lots of variety in Texas. If you don't like it, you can just drive a few 100 miles and get to something different. And it's pretty cool. But like I said, most of our forests, if we call them traditionally, would be over here in East Texas, which is about 12 million acres of timberland or forest land, and about 11 million acres that would be productive timberland, which is about half of the East Texas acres there. So why are forests important? They're important because they are great sinks of carbon dioxide. You hear about this a lot, and especially with all the carbon markets that are popping up recently, where forests do a good job absorbing and storing carbon, and remove it from the atmosphere and store it for a long time. They also provide a lot of other ecosystem services, like help to clean the water. Depending on where you are, you might have a 30, 40, 50% of your water resources, that your drinking water comes from forest landscapes. And so a number of important services that happen there. We have biodiversity, and then of course we have a lot of products that we can use from the forest, everything from something to make a 2x4 out of, to making paper, to doing a number of other things. Of course, there's a lot of interest in the whole biofuels as well. It's a big deal. And if you look across the state and see about our timber supply analysis, it's a big deal. And we are a major player in the world with the forest products, and we do it better, I think, than anybody else. We certainly do it more sustainably than anybody else. And so it's our #1 renewable natural resource. And I like to see us use more wood and not less wood. But you can see the number of, you can see the different types of mills and the number of mills that are scattered across that area. If you look at that, I thought I had one that's for East Texas, but I guess I don't. So there's a number of climax communities, and I'm just about out of time, I'm sure. Megan, you're going to have to pop in whenever I need to shut up. But there's a number of climate communities out there. These are all going to be climate communities, and it all depends about where it is. One thing I wanted to say, though, is that our forests like this is a beautiful stand of longleaf pine that's been managed properly. We do have a big push for restoring longleaf ecosystems in Texas, and so this is one of the stands for which is being done. You can imagine this is very similar that what would it look like when the pioneers first arrived to this part of the world, and it's being managed for similarly. And you can see that it has native grasses down there. It's under a fire regime, and so when we talk about climax communities, we really need to think about the incidences that keep that climax community as that community. And of course, the continent itself is a fire continent, and certainly our forests are dependent upon a regular and frequent fire. And so this is only achievable if we have fire in the system. And as soon as we remove fire from the system, of course, we get something other than this. It's a natural part of how we manage our forests. And so fire, not all fire is bad, just wildfire is bad. And it's also important for hardwood stands too. Here's a hardwood stand. And, in order to get the oak hickory, which is the forest type that we see in many places of Texas, as an oak hickory, we have to put fire in there or something that mimics fire, because oaks are not shade tolerant. And if you remove that, then you'll get so much shade that you lose the oak hickory, and you start getting a bunch of maple and elm types of forests. Same with pine. You would move out of pine into something else. And so what we see a lot of then is these typically unmanaged stands that you're driving down the road that people equate to a healthy forest system, or a stand of trees that they think that foresters like to manage. And of course, this is not the case at all. This disturbs foresters as much as it disturbs anybody else. And of course, this is going to be beetle bait or wildfire waiting to happen. And I'll leave you here then with a few scenes from some historic pictures. Of course, it's by the time that photography came about, we already were starting to exclude fire from the landscape for a number of decades. And so it's hard to find anything that's really truly representative of what the stands might look like when the pioneers first arrived. And of course, they took pictures of them because they were pretty unique or remarkable anyway. And so here's a cool picture in East Texas of you can see that it's been burned regularly. Of course, that's native grasses on the ground. You can't hardly tell that with a black and white picture, but you can see how open it is. Of course, the trees are very large. But, you look at some of these other collections, you can start to see what the exclusion of fire from those forests is starting to slowly creep in more stems, a little bit denser vegetation, which helps to feed wildfire as we keep going through here. So it keeps creeping in with the exclusion of fire. So I think my time might be up right there. Appreciate your opportunity to speak on what a forest is.
Thanks for that presentation, Dr. Taylor. So to continue the theme of forestry, we invite Dr. Taylor to give us an overview of Forestry Management 101. So we'll have 2 presentations from him today. And we know that this is as much as can be covered in 15 minutes, but I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Taylor, to give your second presentation.
Well, hey, just like my comments about what a forest is, I could spend all week with you talking about forest management, and that's what I do. And it's matter of fact, I'm sitting in a hotel room because we're in the process. We're in the middle of our advanced silvicultural workshop that we do annually, and so I have people downstairs listen to presentations, and I have people in the computer listen to presentations about forest management. So that's pretty cool. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Let's look at some really, again, of all the information that I can present to you, I'm going to try to tease out some things that I think are good enough nuggets to drive this talk. And one of the things I always kind of start these conversations with, and the reason why we need to manage forests boils down to a couple of things. And there's a lot of sentiment out there about, well, trees happen. Why do I need to manage them? And if I like the way it is, I like the woods just the way they are, so I wanted to lock it up and put it in a mason jar and preserve it forever, without really realizing that forests are dynamic communities. They're always changing. They're not static. They may change slowly in some cases, and then they may change very quickly with some incident or something like that, but they are changing. And so you can't preserve the woodlands in a mason jar. But what you can do is preserve the idea of what you like and how you like the forest to look and function. But you have to achieve that through active management and purposeful management. As soon as you stop managing it, the absence of management is management. And so, for removing fire from the ecosystem is management. It's not good management, but it's management. Because fire is a crucial part of our forests in this fire continent that we live in. If you don't manage it, then otherwise what you like today may not be there tomorrow, because Mother Nature has a sneaky way of getting up on you there and changing things through catastrophic events. And when Mother Nature does it, you may not like the effect so much. Trees have lifespans. Ecosystems are always changing. There's a big push to put these preserves in place because they love the way that land looks, and they eliminate any management happening on it. Well, many of the preserves that have been set no longer have the attributes that led to their preservation because of the fact that things change and they're not being managed properly and that kind of thing, to preserve that idea of what they liked in the first place. And one of the things we do, of course, as forest management is try to use the products as wisely as we can in a sustainable way. And of course, a lot of that is the fiber that we get off of out of our forests. And why bother doing that? Well, I put a little video of the current world population. This was 2 days ago, and this may depress everybody. I don't know. But, there's 7.9 billion people in the world and rising. And the rest of these numbers that I have are to the left are going to be somewhat dated. But we use 11.5 million tons of wood every day. In the US, we're about 4.5% of the world population, but we use 27% of the world, 27% of the wood in the world, and which is about 2.7, more closely to 3 million tons each and every day, because we produce a lot of things, and we are, again, the wood basket of the world. And so we produce a lot of things. Even if we're not producing it, we're shipping our fiber to other countries that produce it for us, like paper. And so there's a lot of people who are using wood. And they are using wood for a number of purposes, to build houses to live in and that kind of thing. In fact, we use enough wood in this country every day to fill this, what is this, AT&T Stadium now? To fill this 3 times every day. That's crazy. So that's a lot of wood. And for the most part, in this country anyway, we do it in a sustainable way. We have lots of requirements and volunteer practices that help us to make sure that we can manage our wood safely and sustainably, unlike many other parts of the world. So we use more wood than all metal, plastics, and cement combined. And again, the southern states currently supply about 60% of the U.S. demand, and most of it comes from private forests, which are good markets for landowners. The South produces more timber than any other single country, and the demand for that has risen about 32% in the last 20 years. So we expect that to continue to increase because, again, it is renewable and it serves so many functions for us. So what is forest management? Well, trees happen, again, why manage? Well, foresters manage for everything. I'm a forester. My title is a silviculturist, and silviculture is, if silvics is how a tree grows, then silviculture is how to grow trees. It's as simple as that. And I manipulate the structure of trees on property to achieve whatever goals the landowner might have. And I manage everything. And so I'm manipulating the tree structures, I'm also manipulating the understory as well to achieve goals. And so I'm always considering the timber portion of that, because private landowners need to make some money growing the crop. You wouldn't want, it's just like any agricultural crop. If you're not making money at it, you need to do something different. And then we got wildlife habitat that we manage for. Again, I'm a forester, so I manage for wildlife. I manage for the water quality. I manage for the soil health. If I was just managing for timber, I'd be a timberer, But we look at aesthetics. We have a number of tricks up our sleeves to make sure that we can achieve our goals and maintain something that's pleasing to look at. And those properties that aren't usually managed by forests. We consider the recreational value, of course, all those ecosystem services values like carbon sequestration, air quality, water quality. We're always concerned with those. And so, again, this is a nice, well-managed forest that is frequent fires running through that system. You can see that it's got lots of native ground covers on it. And this is what we like to shoot for in many of our circumstances. How do we manage forests? Well, again, it means more than just timber management. It means that we're managing for forest health. It means we're managing for the reduction of risks. If we can improve, or if we can keep a forest under healthy forest management and do the types of silvicultural practices we need in a timely fashion, and then we are reducing the risk of loss from catastrophic events like wildfire, insects, and disease. If we have a healthy forest, we are essentially fireproofing and insect proofing to some degree, disease proofing our forest stands. If not proofing them, at least they are going to be resilient enough to bounce back once a catastrophic event does happen. And we do that with techniques that do nothing more than mimic Mother Nature. So all the tools that we have in our tool bag are really just taken from Mother Nature's examples, like prescribed burning. We have thinning. We have mechanical means to help manage our forests. We have pesticides that we can use, and even clear cuts are things that mimic Mother Nature. The different types of reforestation mimic Mother Nature, and all this is achieved through silviculture. And we make sure that we use our best management practices for that as well. So silviculture is the application of the principle of forest ecology to the stand of trees. It's how we grow trees. And again, all that. First, we like to do is in silviculture is in forest management. We want to determine what the goals are for the forest. So all landowners have goals. They may not have very reasonable goals, but we help to narrow down what's possible on their land. And we certainly work with them to achieve their goals on that, whether it be wildlife management, recreation, birds and butterflies, or timber production, and how important each of those might be in a sequential order. And then we evaluate the existing condition of the forest. We got to know what we have so we know how to get to where we want to go. There's a number of ways that we do that. And then we decide what treatments, if any, can help reach those goals. And this can be somewhat tricky because there's always going to be more than one way to skin a cat. And sometimes you have treatments that may cause unintended consequences down the road to be very careful about. And then we need to implement those treatments at the right time. And this is the big trick. It's very difficult for us, even though sometimes if we know what we want to do and when we need to do it, sometimes it's still very difficult for us to get it done in a timely fashion, especially with today's strain that we have on the logging industry and other contractors. For example, we look at things like prescribed burning. Of course, that's a natural part of the ecosystem, right? We remove the competition, we enhance wildlife habitat, we can reduce fuel loads, we can increase the health of the forest stand. Maybe not initially, but certainly if not too hot, we can certainly do that very quickly. Remember that too, that forests are very long-lived organisms or ecosystems, and just like it takes a long time for them to decline, it also takes a long time for us to make improvements to those forests. And so something that's been declining for the last 60 years, a forester is not going to fix in the next year or two. It's going to take some time to do that, but it's worth it. So we use prescribed burning, we use thinning, which is a way that we remove some of the competition in the forest. We got to remove some of the trees so that the remaining trees can have the nutrients, the sunlight, the space, and the moisture that they need to be healthy, happy, vigorous, and keep growing. And of course, that also opens up sunlight to the forest floor that has all other kinds of benefits. Well, so we do mechanical thinning, and that's something that simply mimics Mother Nature, you know. But rather than Mother Nature would just throw those trees in the ground, we use those trees to provide all those things that we need on a daily basis. And of course, it's going to result in a healthier forest if the remaining trees have the nutrients that they need. And here's a picture that I like to show of a example of a unthinned forest on the right and a thinned forest on the left, and how I talked about things. A well-managed forest could be somewhat fireproof. Well, this is a good example. This is not in East Texas. This is actually Ponderosa Pine, but it's very similar ecosystem. You can see in the right where a wildfire came through, and it was an unmanaged stand. It was very dense, had lots of fuel loads on it, and it pittered out as soon as it reached over into the thinned area of that forest. And so that managed forest to the left, which looks pretty good, you know, was saved simply because of the fuel reduction from the thinning and a prescribed burn that took place in that forest stand, which essentially fireproofed it. And so there's some very big advantages to doing that, not just tree health itself. Regeneration harvest we have also mimics nature. And so they might do a seed tree or shelter wood, and those terms we don't have time to get into those terms there, but you've heard of clear cuts, and yes, even clear cuts mimic Mother Nature. So here's a seed tree. You know what we do? We harvest all the trees except for maybe 4 to 6 trees per acre, and those remaining trees, tall trees, mature trees, provide seed for the new stand underneath it. So you can see the seed trees left behind there, and all the young trees popping up below were not planted, but they came from seed source that fell from those top trees. Well, hey, that mimics. That's another shot of it there. That simply mimics what happens with like a tornado, right? We have tornadoes, high wind events where, you know what, it knocks down all but 4 to 6 trees per acre. And those remaining trees were the strongest ones, which is good because that can provide the seed source for the next crop of trees, which perpetuates the strength of the system. But the only difference is those trees are left on site, and they are heavy fuel loads and can cause other problems, whereas in our system, we would simply take those trees and use them to meet all renewable resource needs. Same thing with hurricanes. You have hurricanes at the top there, you have strong wind events that just push down all the trees, and not so much in the second. That'd be more of a seed tree or a shelter wood type of thing that would happen by Mother Nature. And so we can mimic that through a clear cut. How's that different than a clear cut? Well, the trees there are just laying on the ground, but in our clear cut, we actually take those trees and use them for producing fiber. Pine, loblolly pine is all of our southern pine is one of the few crops, one of the few species out there that will naturally come back in pure stands. And so if you see a pure stand of trees in a plantation, it's only unnatural because they're planted in rows, but Mother Nature does put pine back because it's a pioneer species as a pure stand. And so here's a clear cut. You can see it's very similar to what would have happened with a high wind event, except for there's no stems laying on the ground because we removed those and used them. And if we don't do that, then we can see there's problems with overdensity. And this is one of those preserves that I talked about before that was unmanaged. And of course, because it was unmanaged, we had some situations that were very unhealthy. And if you do have an insect attack that can get a foothold on that, you can lose thousands and thousands of acres due to insect attack. And this is a southern pine beetle doing its job. And so, of course, we like to use best management practices for that. And these are going to be volunteer, but very highly scrutinized. And in Texas, we do a very good job with following best management practices. The Texas A&M Forest Service does a very good job reviewing logging sites and those kind of things. And so it works well in Texas, I think. And they're all there to protect soil and water quality. Everything from leaving streamside management zones where we leave a certain amount of vegetation within 60 feet or more of each side of the stream, so that the sediments erosion doesn't reach into the creek and become sediments and that kind of problem. And how we construct roads and those kind of things. We follow some pretty strict rules that, frankly, other countries wouldn't do so well. And so here's a picture of an SMZ in a recent clear cut that has been planted. And so you can see how the SMZ serves to really protect that body of water, those creeks. And you can see, of course, the new vegetation, the new trees popping up already. So that's a pretty cool picture right there. And I will leave with you. So here's a clear cut in a forest stand that's going to be replanted. Is this deforestation? No, because it's only the temporary removal of trees from the property. The trees will be replanted and even have a healthier. You can see several different types of forest stands, and they're all different years and different species makeup in that area. Is this deforestation? Hey, the trees were all cut. We got a concrete slab in there. We even got a concrete going in where the creek is, and we're going to build a big box store up there, and so the trees will never be back. Of course, that is deforestation. So, with that, Megan, I am out of time, and I'm done. So, good timing.
Fantastic. Dr. Taylor, that was great. I learned a lot just in that short 15 minutes. So I'll turn it over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Megan. Next up, we have Courtney Blevins, the Fort Worth Regional Forester with Texas A&M Forest Service, with us to speak about understanding oak wilt. Courtney gained a degree in forestry from Stephen F. Austin in 1983. In 1984, he started work with the Texas Forest Service in East Texas, moving to West Texas operation in Lubbock in 1987. In 1991, he transferred to Dallas to become the new urban forester for that area, and since 2004 has been the regional forester in the Fort Worth region. He is both a certified forester and board certified master arborist. Welcome to the plant party, Courtney. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so starting off here, the first little talk is oak wilt. And, you know, depending on where you are in the state, you may or may not be familiar with this this issue. It is our biggest tree disease problem in the state. And as the name of the disease implies, it's a problem for oak trees. There are a lot of different oak species in Texas. Texas has more different species of oak trees than any other state in the country, and they all can be impacted by this disease. Now, one thing about the oaks is they are separated into a couple of groups. There's a red oak group and a white oak group, and the red oaks are much more susceptible to oak wilt than some of the white oaks. In my own area, I'm out of the Fort Worth region. We've got a forest type that comes down into our region out of Oklahoma and Kansas called the cross timbers, and it is a post oak dominated forest. And luckily for us, post oak is probably the most resistant oak to oak wilt, or would really have a lot more issues with it here. But that said, we've got plenty of other oaks here, and again, all over the state that are impacted by this disease. So we'll try and fly through this really quick. Here in Texas, it was first identified in 1961. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't here before that. That's just the first time it was officially identified. And all oaks, as I mentioned, are susceptible, but especially the live oaks and the red oak group. There's a lot of different red oaks. If you go into a nursery and tell them you want to buy a red oak, you need to be more specific than that, because there's a lot of different red oaks. And in some parts of the state, you may have them be called Spanish oaks. It's all the same thing. And this is a fungal disease, and what it does, it gets into the vascular system of the tree and plugs it up so that water does not get up to the canopy of the tree. So the tree essentially dies from a lack of water, just like it might do in drought, because these fungal spores are plugging up the vascular system of the tree. Now, this disease spreads in a couple of different ways. I mentioned that red oaks and live oaks are the most susceptible to this disease. On the red oaks, the fungal pathogen can form reproductive structures called fungal mats underneath the bark of the tree, and these mats are where new spores are produced, and these spores, of course, then can be spread to fresh wounds on other trees by a little beetle. It's called a knitted doolid beetle, and it's just a tiny thing. I think there's a picture in here in a second. A tiny little thing. But it's a sap feeding beetle, so it's attracted to fresh wounds on trees. Well, this fungal mat that you can see in the picture here, it's kind of sweet, it's kind of moist, and so the beetles are attracted to that too. And so if they land on that and get the spores on them, then they leave the tree and go to another tree where there's a fresh wound, and so they can transport the spores that way. It has to be a fresh wound on the other tree. If it's a wound that's 3, 4, 5 days old and dried out, the spores cannot infect the new tree. So that's one way it spreads. Now, only the red oaks make this fungal mat. The live oaks do not make these fungal mats, but they spread mostly through root connections, and the red oaks can spread to other red oaks through roots. The live oaks can spread to other live oaks through roots. The live oaks can spread to red oaks through roots. And the way this happens is that when you get trees grown in close proximity over a number of years, and their roots cross each other over time, where they touch, they will graft together. And so you essentially, you can look at several trees out in a pasture, and a lot of times they are really functioning as one organism because of these root grafts. So again, it spreads two ways: the fungal mat, the spores, through the air with the knitted doolid beetle, or through root connections, which is really the most common spread, the root connections. Here's a map it's a little out of date. Well, it's a lot out of date, but it still looks the same pretty much today. And you can see the darker the county, the heavier the presence of oak wilt. And you'll also notice out here in the high plains, Lubbock area, and then down the Permian Basin, Midland, Odessa, and even Wichita Falls, those counties now have oak wilt. And you might think, or might wonder, how the heck did it get out there? And we're pretty sure it's infected firewood. Somebody's got red oak trees that have the disease. They've got fungal mats on them. They cut the tree down and move that firewood to other areas of the state. This is how a lot of pathogens and pests spread. We've got emerald ash borer now that's showed up in the Metroplex, and pretty sure that spread through moving infested firewood. So anyway, it shows, interesting to me too, it does not show any oak wilt in East Texas. It has now shown up in Harris County, and there's plenty of oaks in East Texas, but you don't get as much of like a monoculture over there. There's a lot of different tree species in East Texas, more diversity than you get in Central Texas. You get in Central Texas, you'll get into several counties that are just real heavily populated with live oaks or various red oaks. And so I'm thinking it is in East Texas, just don't have a positive ID on it yet. This is if you're from Fort Worth, you might recognize this map. This is basically the eastern half of Tarrant County, and I used to have this on my office wall, and I'd put a little dot everywhere we'd get a new report of oak wilt or find a new oak wilt infection site. Now, each dot doesn't necessarily mean one tree. Each dot may be dozens of trees, but you can see just in Tarrant County, where Fort Worth is, on the eastern half of the county, they're all over the place. I mean, it's really very prevalent in this area. And I wished I'd have taken the picture and shown the eastern half of Tarrant County. And the reason I didn't is because there are no dots over there. And there is no known oak wilt in eastern Tarrant County because of the species of trees over there. This is where that cross timbers forest is, which is predominantly post oak, it's not immune, but it's very highly resistant to oak wilt. You get over here out of the cross timbers where you've got live oaks and red oaks, and you can see what can happen there. So what does it do? Well, it kills trees, or it may not kill trees. These folks right here, the live oaks, when the live oaks get the disease, they may show no symptoms whatsoever. They may die, or they may be partially defoliated and stay that way for years, which is what some of these trees in this yard are doing. Personally, if I've got trees looking like that, I'm gonna go ahead and take them down. This one over here, this kind of cracks me up. This guy, the tree's dead. He's got no more shade left, so he's got a guy his umbrella out here to work on his car. But the point of this slide is that property values are reduced when you lose trees. Mature, well-maintained trees can increase property values 10 to 15%. As this slide says 20%, that might be stretching it, but they do increase property values. And so if you lose a lot of mature trees, your property values can actually go down. What are the symptoms of oak wilt? They're variable depending on whether you're looking again at live oaks or red oaks. The live oaks can have this pattern here. It's called veinal necrosis, where the veins on the leaves are brown and the areas between the veins are still green. If you see that on a live oak, you've got oak wilt. Now, it does not always show up. Sometimes it depends on the time of year the tree is infected, depends on the amount of soil moisture you got out there, a lot of different factors. So just because you don't see this foliar symptom does not mean you don't have oak wilt. But if you do see it, you've got oak wilt. Now, that said, there's been 2 instances I've heard of where a live oak tree struck by lightning can develop leaves that look like this. That's 2 instances in like my 40 years of doing this. So for the most part, if you see this, you've got oak wilt. And it's hard to see in this picture, but here's a live oak, and the crown is starting to thin right here, going brown. And it's kind of a little bit at a time. So with live oaks, you can get this foliar symptom, and by golly, 100%, yes, I've got oak wilt. There's some other pictures of the veinal necrosis pattern. And you can even see it in early stages. You might be looking at a live oak that you don't see this pattern, but then you look up through with it backlit by the sun, you can see the beginning of that pattern. Now, there's a lot of herbicide damage that can mimic this stuff, but it usually is opposite. You usually can still have green veins, brown in between, or half the leaf is brown and half is still green. That there's a lot of things that can look like that. So again, this pattern, though, that's oak wilt. The red oaks, forget about trying to identify oak wilt by red oak leaves, their symptoms, because it can look like a million other things. You can see those red oak leaves there. That could be drought, that could be overwatering. There's a million things it could be. So you cannot positively identify oak wilt from foliar symptoms on red oak trees. The fungal mat we mentioned before, not all the red oaks that are infected produce fungal mats. And even if they do, they're not obvious like this. They're under the bark. The bark has been removed for this fungal mat up here to view that. So, and even if you do see a fungal mat, there's a lot of other things that can look like that too. So you may kind of have an idea it's oak wilt, but it's not positive. The way the disease progresses in red oaks is usually you'll have a big section of the tree die out, then a couple of weeks later another big section, and within a month or 2, usually if a red oak is infected, the thing's dead. It's not like the live oak where it may show no symptoms or it may partially defoliate. The red oaks, they're goners. Again, back to the spread. Here's a picture of that little beetle. And this thing, it's tiny. It's like the size of a grain of rice. It's sap-feeding beetle. And again, it can be attracted to that fungal mat if it forms on a red oak and get the spores on it and then transport those to a fresh wound on another tree and spread it that way. The bottom picture, this is a stump of a tree right here. And there were other trees in a line planted that are all dead from oak wilt. So we kind of excavated the soil a little bit and spray painted the roots orange so you could see here's a root coming out from this tree and there's a crossing root from another tree. And where they cross and meet, they've grafted together. Same thing over here. They've grafted together. So this tree is sharing whatever it's got with this tree over here and this one down here. And that's the way the disease spreads most commonly is through those root connections. So what do you do about it? There's a couple of things to try and contain the disease or prevent your healthy trees from getting it. Barrier treatments or trenching is usually something done in a more rural setting. Basically what you're doing is you're isolating the infected trees from the healthy trees by cutting those root connections before the disease can spread through the root grafting. This picture on the bottom right, I think this is the infected trees, and so they're cutting those root connections so it doesn't get over here into the to the healthy trees. Tree roots are very shallow. Most of them are in the top foot or two of soil, but that doesn't mean all of them are. So the trench, you need to go at least 4 feet deep just for those straggler roots that get deeper than the norm, because it only takes one root still intact to spread the disease to the other healthy trees. And then I mentioned on a rural setting, that's easier to do. You can have somebody with, say, 100-acre, 1,000-acre ranch, and you go in there and you lay out a trench line, and you're dealing with one property owner. Doing it in an urban area or neighborhood is a lot trickier, because you're not dealing with one property owner usually. You're dealing with several, and they all have to agree. And you've also got all that infrastructure, the streets and the utilities and all that. So it's not, and it's expensive as heck, of course. So it's not done too much in urban areas as it is in rural areas. The other thing to do is you can prevent the disease by injecting the trees with fungicide. Propiconazole is the registered labeled fungicide for this disease, and so it has to be injected into the tree. And there's a couple of methods of doing that. This right here is showing you can't. It's not in the picture, but all these little, you drill holes into the root flare of the tree, and you put these little T's in there, and you hook them all together with tubing, and all that's hooked up to a pressure tank off to the side that's got water and the chemical in it, and the tree will take that up. What's real critical on this is where you put the holes. You do not want to put them up here on the main trunk of the tree. You want to put them down here in the root flare. Dr. Apple's done a lot of research on this. The distribution of the chemical, the fungicide, and the water that's taken up in the tree is much more, much better if you go into the root flare than just into the main trunk of the tree. So preventing it. 1 minute. Okay. Good pruning practices. We at the Texas Forest Service recommend avoiding pruning oak trees between February and June, just because that's when the spores are most prevalent. That's when the beetle is most prevalent. And so try to avoid doing that. Painting wounds, we know that doesn't do anything to help wounds heal, but what it does is it provides a barrier. If you pruned an oak branch and you immediately paint that wound, if that little nitidula beetle's out there flying around, you've put a barrier on that wound where it cannot get on that fresh wound of the tree. Removing diseased trees, if it's red oak, especially burying them, burning them. Once the red oak wood is dried out, the disease is no longer a problem. And then the fungicide treatments, firewood management, that's a whole nother thing. Basically, just don't move uncured firewood, and here's a really easy one. If you've got oak wilt in your area, don't plant oak trees, plant something different. And that'll get it. Again, the injection, there's macro, there's micro, lots of different things, lots of different methods of doing it. And we do have a website you can go to. You can find out what forester or arborist in your area might be able to come out and help you with oak wilt, texasoakwilt.tfs.tamu.edu. And that's it on oak wilt.
All right. Thanks for that great presentation, Courtney. And with that, we'll move right into the next presentation that's titled The Relationship of Trees and Water, which is also being presented by Courtney Blevins. So back to you, Courtney.
All righty. Yeah, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? We all know trees need water, and we all know we've been in a drought that suddenly ended with the wettest August on record in DFW area, which was really bizarre. We've got all kind of strange things going on up here this year, but trees and drought or trees and water, there's really a difference. I make a big distinction between newly planted trees and mature trees, because they have drastically different requirements for what they need related to water. Mature trees usually do not need supplemental watering. Now we get into something like we did, this year with the drought, or back in 2011, or what, I think 1980 maybe. These were big drought years, so they can definitely benefit from some supplemental watering, the mature trees, but usually they don't need anything. Mature trees, for the most part, don't need a lot of help from us. There's all kinds of tree care or lawn care services that recommend fertilizing your trees on a regular basis, add that nitrogen and all that stuff once or twice a year, and it's really not necessary. And the same goes for usually for watering the trees. A mature tree doesn't usually need it. But again, you get into a drought year, they can certainly benefit from a little supplemental watering, because when trees die, we just talked about oak wilt, and that's one pathogen that can kill a tree. Well, that's not usually what kills trees. It's usually a combination of stress factors that build up over time in a tree. And so drought is certainly a huge stress factor around here. Too much water can be a stress factor on some trees, like post oaks, for instance. They don't like excess water. So all these stresses build up on a tree. So when I sit here and say you don't normally need to water a mature tree, you might not need to water the mature tree during a drought to keep it alive. There's plenty of trees, mature trees, that don't die during a drought, but they are being stressed. So even though it's not dead or dying, you can still reduce that stress by some supplemental watering. So that's a mature tree. That's during periods of drought, you can go out there and add some water to it. Newly planted trees, however, are a whole different ball game. You have to water newly planted trees, and even ones that are extremely drought tolerant, like say desert willow or Texas madrone. To get those things established, you do need to add supplemental watering, and on a fairly regular basis. And I always get this question, well, how much do you water a new tree? And that question kind of drives me nuts, because the only right answer is it depends. There's so many factors that go into determining that. And hopefully I can figure out how to show a video here in a second. Just a short video of how to maybe determine when the soil needs to be watered, and kind of help with that. But a newly planted tree, it's got to get the roots established. You've taken a tree, usually it's in some black plastic container, and you pull it out, and it's got its roots all in that little root ball there, and you stick it in a hole, and you plant it. And what's got to happen for that tree to grow and thrive is those roots have to get out away from that root ball. They've got to extend into the surrounding soil, right? And so that's not going to happen without some supplemental watering, because that little root ball will dry out really easy. It's amended soil. It's usually got peat moss in it. It's usually a much lighter type of mix than whatever your native soil is in there. So the newly planted trees, they have to be given quite a bit of water. So first off, fly through this. An idea of the roots of a tree. Where are the roots? Where do they grow? Most of a tree's roots, I mentioned this briefly in the oak wilt presentation, most of a tree's roots are in the top 1 foot of soil. So, and everything I say is a rule of thumb. I know you can take anything I say and find an example that doesn't apply, but rule of thumb, about 90% of most tree roots are in the top 1 foot of the soil. So they're very shallow, and they're very shallow because that's where the oxygen is. We all know trees' roots need water. They also need oxygen, and the oxygen's in the atmosphere. So in the soil, most of the oxygen's near the surface. So that's where the roots are. So it doesn't take a whole lot of drought for the surface layers of the soil to dry out. Some trees do have tap roots. They're not really pulling up a lot of water. They're there for stability. And most of those with tap roots, like pecans or pine trees, as the tree matures, that tap root gradually decays and fades away. So they're in the surface layers. They're very shallow and very susceptible to drying out, depending on your soil type. How far out do they go? They go a long ways out from the tree. We used to teach well, I didn't, but somebody did, that the root system of a tree is kind of a mirror image of the crown of the tree, and that's not true at all. They're not only shallow, they go out a long ways from the tree. Again, rule of thumb is for most of our species, you take the height of the tree and the roots are going out 2 to 3 times the height of that tree. So you got a 50-foot tall tree, you got roots going out in a radius of 150 feet all the way around that tree. So 300-foot diameter. So it's a big area of roots that are looking for water and wanting to pull up some moisture to keep them going. Oh yeah, there's some pictures here. Just we did some air spading to show where the roots were, just to demonstrate they are fairly shallow. So this little tool uses air to displace the soil without damaging the roots. And you can see that there's a lot of roots there, and they're really close to the surface of the plant. Yeah, there we go. So roots are opportunistic, and they're mostly on the surface. The other big factor in when to water a tree, how often to water a tree, is the soil, of course. This goes back to what I said, it's like, it depends. Well, it depends on the climate, it depends on the rainfall, and it depends big time on your soil. Your soil. Soil is, I think most people here already know all this stuff. Soil is composed of sand, silt, and clay. And the percentages of each determine things like the amount of water the soil can hold, the amount of nutrients the soil can hold. So if you've got a soil that is high sand content, it is going to be much more drouthy than something with a high clay content. A soil with a high clay content can actually hold too much water that can cause damage to plants. So again, when do you water this newly planted tree? How often do you water it? Well, it kind of depends on the soil and the drainage. And you can do a drainage test. You can dig a hole and put some water in it and see how fast it drains out. Hopefully it drains in less than 24 hours. If it doesn't, you probably got a heavy clay soil. But the soils matter as far as water holding capacity. The sandier it is, the less it's able to hold on to moisture, and the more often you would have to water. There's where you can do a drainage test. Just dig a hole, fill it with water. Hopefully it drains within an hour, but it might not. And you might have to adjust your species that way too. More pictures just showing where those roots are. Another problem you can encounter with newly planted trees and water intake is what you buy at the nursery. You could do everything right. You can plant the tree perfectly by all the rules, water it, and it could still die on you because of the condition it was in when you bought it. These are pictures of trees that were left in their pots too long and they became root bound. And so the roots start circling around like that. And what happens, the way a tree grows is it just adds a layer every year. So this trunk adds a layer every year. This root adds a layer every year. So they both keep getting bigger. At some point they meet. And when that happens, the tree can get girdled or choked off, and it'll look like water stress. It can look like nutrient deficiency. It can look like a lot of things, but it's not anything you're doing wrong from not watering. It's what you got from the nursery. So that can impact this stuff too. Here's some things. And again, how often do I water this newly planted tree? There's lots of research out there, but it's so variable depending on things like the soil, where you are, the species. Dr. Gilman at University of Florida says 2 gallons per inch caliper twice a week. Well, he's in Florida and his research is usually on sandy soils. Does that apply when you get over to some of our areas in Texas that have heavy clay soils? Probably not. Here's Dr. Peterson, never more than twice a month, not to exceed 10 times a year. If you planted a tree this spring in Texas, you better have watered it more than twice a month, because it got hot and dry. Evapotranspiration, that's a more scientific way to look at it, but it's more complicated too. You can actually insert soil monitoring, moisture monitoring devices in the soil if you got, for instance, commercial nursery, and you really need to know that stuff. But again, here's what I think. Newly planted trees, every 3 to 7 days during the growing season, every couple of weeks during dormancy for the first year, every 1 or 2 weeks in the second growing season. They do need to still be watered over winter when they're dormant. Just because they don't have leaves on them, the roots still need to be kept moist. Mature trees, maybe once a month during a prolonged drought. drought. This is just my thoughts on it. There's no research here at all. Well, there probably is. I just don't know about it. And the other thing too, there's a lot of different devices for applying this water. Lawn sprinklers for grass, they will help a mature tree during drought. I've got a live oak in my front yard. I don't give it any supplemental watering during drought, and I've got lawn sprinklers, but that lawn sprinkler system will not sufficiently water a newly planted tree. You got to do something else. Usually we recommend some kind of watering that's slow so it can soak in, get down that foot or two into the soil. Grass roots really are very good at outcompeting tree roots for moisture. And so a good deep watering, if you're going to do it, helps. There's lots of different stuff you can hook up and bubblers, whatever, to try and water a tree. Soaker hoses. In the drought of 2011, you couldn't buy a soaker hose anywhere. Everybody was buying those things to water. At this thing, I've never seen that in my life. I don't know what that came from. Watering bags. Again, it's newly planted trees. It's much more critical. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on how much. Another thing that can help a whole lot during drought, or actually not just during drought, anytime, is mulch. Mulch is huge. I am the biggest proponent of mulching under the around the base of a tree that you'll ever find. I mentioned grass really does a good job of outcompeting tree roots for nutrients and moisture. If you could take away the Bermuda, the San Augustine, whatever turf grass you have underneath that tree and replace it with 2 to 3 inches of mulch, you're going to provide a world of benefits for that tree. One of them is increasing or holding the moisture in the soil longer. That's just one of them. There's all kinds of other benefits from mulch. So I'm a big proponent of that. That can help reduce the impact of drought and reduce the amount of times you've got to water. This, though, too much mulch is not a good thing. This is called volcano mulching. And they've piled up like a foot of mulch on the trunk of that tree. Well, remember, 2 to 3 inches is all you need. You don't really want it touching the trunk of the tree. You sure don't want this situation here because, again, the roots want to be where the oxygen is, and you've buried that tree. And you're also causing some unfavorable conditions on the trunk where it's kept too moist. And the trunk will actually start forming roots out there. So don't do this, a little less than that. You can see there how moist it is around that trunk when you pull away that volcano mulching. The other thing to remember after drought or after any stress, but what we'll be seeing for years to come is an increase in certain diseases and insects. One of the ones you'll see a lot more of, especially it seems like in post oaks, is this disease called hypoxalin. It's another fungal disease. It's another one that plugs up the vascular system. And this thing is related to stress. If a tree is not stressed, it will not have a problem with hypoxalin. Well, drought, lack of water, that's a major stress to the tree. And so we will see increases in hypoxalin. And you've probably all seen this without really thinking about it or noticing it, but you all of a sudden it'll look like all the bark fell off your tree. And it's not really all of a sudden, but it's usually what people tell me. It happened overnight. And then you'll have this powdery substance on the trunk of the tree. It may be brown. It may be gray. It depends on the stage, the life stage, cycle stage of the fungus. It'll eventually go jet black on there and it kills the tree. But this is stress related. So if you do have, say, a mature tree, it's drought, providing that supplemental watering during the drought can maybe help reduce the incidence of hypoxalin. And there's no cure for it. They've found there's another fungal disease called Phytophthora that they found phosphorus acid is pretty good at preventing. They're also thinking it might help prevent hypoxalin, but it's not labeled for that yet. So you can't apply phosphorus acid treatment for hypoxalin control technically because it's not yet labeled for that. But these are all just the different stages of hypoxalin. And like I said, there's no known chemical cure that's labeled for it anyway. And you can see that middle picture. It looks like tar on the thing at the end of it. Megan, how much time do I have? I don't know if I got time to show this video. Let's see.
You've got about a minute.
Okay, I do not have time to show the video at the end. You can go on the Texas A&M Forest Service website, and I think you can search for watering. Actually, you can do it on YouTube. Let's see here. Yeah, water your trees. Texas A&M Forest Service, water your trees. And it's just a short video, but it shows a method to determine, is the soil too dry or not? And all it really involves is getting one of those really big screwdrivers and try and push it into the soil. And if you can't push it into the soil at all, then maybe it's time to water. If it goes in there easily, then wait and water later. Now, of course, that's highly variable depending on if you're in Central Texas where it's all rock or not, but it's just one way to kind of get an idea of when to water your trees. So that is it.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was excellent information I know we'll all benefit from.
So we're ready to get our last presentation started. We're happy to welcome Dr. Larry Stein, Regents Fellow, Professor Extension Horticulturalist, who began his AgriLife career as an extension assistant in 1980, attained the rank of professor in 1999, and accepted an additional role in 2012 as Associate Department Head and Extension Program Leader in Horticultural Sciences. He's worked to improve crop production, primarily of spinach, pecans, grapes, and citrus, as well as Texas superstar plants. Dr. Stein has helped producers stay at the forefront of modern agriculture and ahead of constant challenges by teaching producers about new technology and practices. Stein is a 5-time team recipient of AgriLife Extension's highest employee honor, the Superior Service Award, and has assisted with the release of new table grapes, Victoria Red, and 2 bluebonnet varieties, Texas Maroon and Ladybird Johnson Royal Blue. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Stein, and we're here for your presentation all about epiphytes.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Great to be with you today. Today, we're talking about epiphytes, and a lot of people are seeing Spanish moss and everything on these trees. We'll talk about ball moss here directly. And, as dry as it's been, a lot of times you might think it may be making it worse. And epiphytes may be making it worse. But in reality, they're not hurting the tree. And so typically, epiphytes are also known as air plants. And we define an epiphyte as any plant that grows on another plant or object. And so I'm going to show y'all some pictures here directly of them growing on not only other trees, but on fences, things like that. They only get support from the plant or the object. There's no attachment to the ground, although in certain cases you can have that. And I'll show you an example of that here directly. They're not parasitic to the plant. And that's something that we'll talk about here directly. And usually, for the most part, they're found in moist tropical areas is where you see the most epiphytes. But we'll show you examples of where they're not grown there and they occur in other places. So the majority of the epiphytes are angiosperms. And so we see those as orchids, orchids. Spanish moss is another big one. And then the bromeliad family, the pineapple family. So those are the major epiphytes that we see. Realize also that 1/3 of all ferns are epiphytes. And for the most part, epiphytes are uncommon in arid environments, except for ball moss. And ball moss is the big one that we have to deal with. And we're going to talk more about that here directly. 2 specific type of epiphytes. Hollow epiphyte is a plant that spends its whole life cycle without contact with the ground. A good example of that would be an orchid. And then you have hemi epiphyte, which is a plant that spends only half. And eventually the roots do come to the ground. And a prime example of that is Strangler Fig. So here is an orchid. Y'all have seen orchids growing. We grow orchids as houseplants. We'll talk about that here directly a little bit more. And then this is a Strangler Fig here. And eventually that Strangler Fig will kill the secondary xylem of that tree and actually cause it to die. But those roots start up on the tree and eventually they come down to the ground. So that's where it gets that particular definition. So epiphytes survive from the water nutrition from the rain and dew. They're not getting any water and dew for water from the plant. They absorb the nutrients from the debris on the supporting plants. So as they decay, that's where they get there. They're relying on wind and animals for seed dispersal. And as you well know, the older parts of the plant, especially with ball moss, typically tend to have more epiphytes on them. And as you might guess, epiphytes can make good houseplants due to minimum water and soil requirements. Many times, most houseplants die because we water them too much. So epiphytes, you're not typically going to overwater them, and you ought to be in better shape. Now, epiphytes are not like something like mistletoe, which mistletoe is a parasite on the plant. It literally puts roots into the bark of the tree there and derives its nutrition from the plant. And if you don't believe that, girdle that limb there, and pretty soon the mistletoe will be dead. And so the epiphytes that we're talking about today are not this. They're not parasites on the plant. They're merely getting their support from the plant, and then they get their nutrition and water from debris as well as rain and dew. So a very common one along some of the rivers is Spanish moss. And Spanish moss is thought to be, very beautiful. I mean, it kind of presents a picturesque setting. And but realize that Spanish moss also was used for certain things early on. I mean, it resembles a lichen, but it's not. It's not a moss either, nor is it native to Spain. It provides habitat for many insects, but there's a lot of hype that it provides habitat for chiggers, which is not the case. Really, it was used for some insulation, and it is still used in swamp coolers. That mesh that's on the side of a swamp cooler that the water runs over, it still is used in that particular use there. So this is, again, another picture of Spanish moss. It's interesting. I live on the Medina River, and there's only certain areas of the Medina River that have Spanish moss, and it likes oak trees, of course, but also bald cypress. You're typically going to find a lot of Spanish moss. But like I said, on this particular river, it's only in certain areas. It's not typically everywhere. The one that we get the most grief about, though, is ball moss. And if we had one call on ball moss killing trees, we've had 100. And, like this particular limb right here, it's probably dead, and it's covered with the ball moss that you see there. But in reality, that limb probably shaded out, and the ball moss is just being supported by the limb right there. Here, we're seeing it on high lines. Ball moss, you can talk to people and tell them, no, it's not. You can show them pictures of this. You can show them pictures of ball moss on barbed wire fences. But a lot of these guys are not believing it. They're still thinking that the ball moss may be getting something out of the tree. Now, in reality, if you get enough ball moss, like this year, we've been hearing about drought stress, etc., so leaves are thin. So you can get enough of this ball moss and other epiphytes that you can actually hinder the light coming into the tree. And so in that instance, you could have a little bit of damage to the tree, but in reality, it's not from the plant deriving the nutrition or water from the plant itself. Starts off, germinates, spread by wind, germinates on the trunk. You'll see it. Here you see lichens as well beside the ball moss there, and it will gradually grow to a larger size. And typically you don't see a whole lot. I mean, pecan, this is on pecan. Typically don't see a lot on pecan. It's mainly on oak trees is typically where we see it, some elm trees, but occasionally you'll see some on bald cypress where you have Spanish moss as well. So it is an epiphyte, though. Usually it's not that severe, 1 or 2 balls up in the tree. A lot of homeowners, though, have a lot of it, and they like to get rid of it. Of course, you can spray in the spring if you're so inclined to do that. The only label product would be Courtney copper hydroxide, which is what you could use. The importance of epiphytes, they contribute to the biodiversity of the forest. They also contribute to organic matter. They provide food and living accommodations for insects, birds, mammals, etc. A lot of people use it as home decorations, Spanish moss, used in different locales around the house. They do produce some food. Obviously, pineapple, a bromeliad, and vanilla actually comes from orchids. And then there's also another wide variety of other compounds that come from epiphytes. So a typical house plant, this is orchid, this is Phalaenopsis orchid, makes a great house plant. And so it would be considered to be an epiphyte. This is pineapple that we've been talking about, of course, and it is also considered to be an epiphyte. If you're growing pineapple, it's best to water into the whorl, and that way the plant will pick up some of the water nutrition from the water that you're putting on that. But the most common epiphyte, other than ball moss, is our Spanish moss. Really adds to the beauty of Texas. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking, and that's the 15-minute synopsis on epiphytes today.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes.
Stein, for that great presentation.
And we also want to thank our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, Bear Crop Science, Native American Seed, Renewable Resources Extension Act, Texas Brigades, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We appreciate your support of the Plant Party. Thanks again to our speakers and to all of you for attending our 8th Plant Party webinar. Again, Plant Party is a quarterly advanced plant webinar training series brought to you by USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and sponsored by the Renewable Resources Education Act. We will be sending a link to a short survey by email, or you can type in the address you see on your screen and chat box, or we'll pop up the QR code that you can simply hold your phone camera over and click on the link that pops up. The next Plant Party will be on December 21st. To bring your learning cap for some pre-holiday fun, we'll send an email with more information to all the past registrants. Thanks again.